we passed last month or two. So on those happier notes, I want to say on this Delaware Day, Mr. President, thanks for giving me the time to talk about some leadership that's needed and the ability, the willingness to compromise if we can't get Mr. Corday confirmed here this week. I thank you for this time. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, 70 years ago today, even as I speak, at 07:45 in the morning in Hawaii, where it's now about 8:40 in the morning, our country was attacked at Pearl Harbor, bringing us into World War II, a war that had been ongoing in Europe for more than 3 years and in Asia in different forms for a much longer period, probably 7 to 8 years. This began a national effort that was historically unprecedented in its unity and in its vigor, in which the United States astounded the world in terms of its capacity to respond to this attack in many different fronts. Our economic production was staggering. By 1943, our production schedule included 125,000 aircraft, 75,000 tanks, 35,000 anti-aircraft guns, 10 millions of tons in merchant shipping. During the course of that war, the productive capacity of this country gave our Allied forces more than half of all of its armaments, including 86% of the armaments that were used in response to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. But I rise today really to express my thanks and my appreciation to the men and women of that generation who stepped forward and responded to the call of service in this period. During World War II, more than 16 million Americans stepped forward to serve our country. And in that period, more than 400,000 of them died, including 291,557 who were killed in action. Another 670,846 were wounded in action. Of those 16.1 million today, about 1.7 million World War II veterans remain alive. They are carrying the torch in the memory of this larger group that stepped forward and served and became known as the greatest generation. And it is my profound pleasure and, quite frankly, my duty to stand forward and remember all of them today. Among those 16 million who served, nearly 8 million were able to take advantage of the World War II GI Bill. It was my honor to have introduced a similar GI Bill on my first day here in the Senate in 2007, and within 16 months, our body and the other body had come together to agree on an educational package that would allow those who've served since 9/11 to have the same chance at a first-class future as those who served during World War II, a program that would pay their tuition, buy their books, give them a monthly stipend. And on this day of remembrance for those who served during World War II, we should also remember that for every dollar that was spent on the World War II GI Bill, our Treasury received $7 in tax reimbursements because of the ability of the greatest generation to have successful careers and to contribute to our economy. So today, I would just like to say, as many of us here, as one of many of us here who are the next generation from the great generation, how thankful I am for the service that they gave and for the example that they set when they returned from war. For many of us, for me, they were our parents. They were our mentors. They were our role models. They were our leaders as we ourselves matured into leaders. They taught us how to love our country. They taught us how to value the notion of service. Their legacy is in every area of our society today. We honor them, and we should resolve, all of us, to continue in the traditions that were imbued in them, imbued in us by their sacrifices and the example they set when they returned from a most difficult war. I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka. before we adjourn for the holidays. And there's certain legislation that we must get done before we leave town. We call these the must-pass bills that we have to make sure are enacted before Congress adjourns for the year. One, of course, is what President Obama has been talking about. We need to deal with the payroll tax issue. We don't want to see middle-income families find on January 1st that their paychecks, the amount of money actually in their that they take home, is actually reduced. During this economic time, we got to make sure that the money remains constant and that we don't want to see additional burdens placed on middle-income families. We all know that we have to deal with the Medicare extenders, including the physician problems. We have a flawed system for reimbursing physicians. It would cause a substantial reduction in rates for physicians to receive, 27% reductions. That would affect not only the fairness of our reimbursement system to our doctors, but would also affect access that Medicare patients would have to physicians. So we need to absolutely take care of that issue. We have the omnibus appropriation bill, and I certainly hope that's going to be an appropriation bill so we can give some predictability through the remainder of this fiscal year. We got to get that done before we adjourn for the holidays. And then we also need to pass the tax extenders. And I know the presiding officer has been very actively involved in the energy extenders, knowing full well the importance not only to New Mexico but to our entire country. Those extenders need to be passed because if not, we lose jobs. This involves the ability to move forward with sustainable energy projects that will mean jobs in our community and energy self-sufficiency for America. But I want to take this time to talk about another must-pass bill before we adjourn for the year, and that is the extension of the unemployment insurance. To me, that is absolutely essential that we get that done before Congress adjourns for the year. I think we've got to make it clear what this extension would mean is that we would be providing the same number of weeks of unemployment insurance for those who are currently in the system, who have lost their jobs, that we have for the last couple of years for those who have been caught up in this economic downturn. We're not extending beyond what the unemployed have already received. So we are basically extending the current policy because we're still in a very difficult economic circumstance. For every job that is open, there are 4 people who apply for it. So it's very difficult for someone who's unemployed to be able to find employment. And as I know the presiding officer knows, if you're unemployed and looking for work, it's much more difficult. So for all those reasons, the right thing to do is to acknowledge that the number of weeks of benefits should not be reduced at this period, that those who are currently in the system who lost their jobs should be able to get the same number of benefits that earlier unemployed were able to get during this economic period. And that's what this legislation would do. Unemployment insurance is an insurance program. During good times, we pay more into the system. During economic downturns, we take the money out of the system. It's counter-secular so that we help our economy as well as help our families. This is the right thing to do. There are many families that this is the lifeline. This is their ability to be able to provide food on the table for their families, or to keep their home from going into foreclosure, or to pay their rents, or to take care of their family needs. This is the right thing to do from the point of view of families that have been caught up in this economic period. It also, by the way, would affect millions of our families. Over the next year, if we were not to extend the unemployment insurance benefits, it's estimated that 6 million families would be denied their full benefits that they are receiving currently. 6 million families. Each one is a family in our community that would be adversely affected. It also helps our economy. Mark Zandi, who was the economic advisor for the then presidential candidate, Senator McCain, said that for every dollar that we put out in the economy for unemployment benefits, we get back $1.61 in our economy. The multiplier effect of unemployment compensation is positive to our economy. So once again, when we're trying to stimulate job growth, this helps us. How does it help us? Well, the people who receive their unemployment benefits visit our local shops, our small businesses in our community, keeping our economy moving, keeping our path forward to job growth. So for all those reasons, for the fact that it's the right thing to do for families, for what the intent of unemployment insurance is all about, it's the right thing for us to do. It also helps our economy. Mr. President, this must be on our list of must-pass legislation. We've got to get this done before we can adjourn for the remainder of the year. With that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.
Mr. President, Senator from Hawaii is recognized.
Mr. President, today is December the 7th, 2011. 7 years ago, something happened in Pearl Harbor. I shall never forget that day because it was a Sunday, and like many Americans, I was preparing to go to church. I was putting on my necktie and having a good time listening to delightful Hawaiian music. Suddenly, at about this time, 7:55, the disc jockey in charge of that program began screaming, yelling into the mic, and he was saying, "The Japanese are bombing Pearl Harbor." He kept on repeating that. And for a moment I thought it was a repeat or a replay of Orson Welles, if you recall, that program that was a mighty hit in the United States. Well, he kept on doing this for about 5 minutes, no music, just screaming. And so I decided to take my father out on the street and look towards Pearl Harbor. And you could see these black puffs. They were anti-aircraft shells. And then you knew what was happening. But suddenly, while watching these black puffs of explosions, you could hear a rumble just overhead. And there were 3 aircraft. They were pearl gray in color and red dots on the wing. I knew what was happening, and I thought the world had just come to an end. Just about 2,400 American sailors and soldiers and non-combatants died that morning. I was a young man of 17 at that time, but I was also a volunteer medical aid man. And we had a little aid station, temporary one, set up at the elementary school called Lunalilo. And so I rushed there to respond to the call of duty, and I stayed there for about a week, taking care of the wounded and the dead, because we also maintain a morgue in our school premise. I became familiar with the cost of war, not the full cost, but I knew what was happening. That war was much more than just blood and guts. Mr. President, we have an extraordinary Constitution. We have an extraordinary set of laws. But throughout the history of mankind, not just the history of the United States, but the history of mankind, war has always provided some justification to leaders to set aside these laws. For example, on just about Christmas Eve of 1941, about 3 weeks after December the 7th, the United States government made a decision, and that decision was to provide a new designation for Japanese residing in the United States, citizens and non-citizens like my father. And the designation was 4C. Mr. President, as you know, 1A means you're physically fit, mentally alert, and you can put on a uniform. 4F, something's wrong with you. 4C is the designation of an enemy alien. Just imagine that, enemy alien. This was used as one of the justifications to round up over 120,000 Japanese, most of them Americans of Japanese ancestry, and place them into these internment camps. There were 10 of them throughout the United States in very desolate areas: Arkansas, Arizona, Utah, out in the deserts. And their crime was that they were enemy alien. None of them had committed any crime. Investigation after investigation disclosed that. No sabotage, no espionage, no assault, nothing. But they were rounded up and placed into these camps, which were described by our government as concentration camps. Yes, it was unconstitutional, but our leaders felt that the war was a justification to set aside the Constitution and set aside the laws. Well, many of us, who, especially the young ones, were very eager to demonstrate to our neighbors and to our government that we were loyal, that we wanted to do our part in this war, and if necessary, put our lives on the line. And we petitioned the government. Finally, after about a year of petitioning, President Roosevelt issued a statement saying Americanism is not a matter of blood or color. Americanism is a matter of heart and soul. And he says, okay, form a volunteer group, and that was done. We trained in Mississippi, and we did our best. The 100th Battalion, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, were assigned to do our battles in Europe. We fought in Italy and France. We started off the war with about 6,000 men. At the end, over 12,000 had gone through the ranks. So you can imagine the casualty rates. We had about 10,000 Purple Hearts for all the wounds that they received. And we were told that these two units became the most decorated in the history of the United States. Yes, the bombing of Pearl Harbor 7 years ago began a period of my life when I became an adult, and I hope that a good American. It is something that I will never forget. It changed my life forever. Something of interest at this moment. 20 years ago, when we decided to make it a national event, the 50th anniversary of the bombing of Pearl Harbor. On that morning, the President was there, the Secretaries of Defense, Secretary of War, the Secretary of the Interior Department, State Department, all of the important people of the United States were in attendance. And in preparation of this, we took a poll about 6 months before December the 7th, and the poll was among high school seniors, well-educated young boys and girls, and the question was a very simple one. What is the significance of December 7th, 1941? Mr. President, I'm sad to report to you that less than half could respond. Most of them thought it was a birthday of some president or some historic date of some nature, but they couldn't recall what it was. On the 70th anniversary, I just wonder if that poll were taken again, what would be the outcome? Well, I hope that we will remember December the 7th. I hope we will remember 9/11. That was just a few years ago. But people are beginning to forget 9/11, just as well as forgetting December the 7th. If December the 7th is going to teach us anything, it should be that we must remain vigilant at all times, not just to avoid war, but vigilant among ourselves so that we would not use this as a justification to set aside our most honored document, the Constitution. I hope it will never happen again. So, Mr. President, I thank you very much for this opportunity. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Arizona.
Mr. President, I'm very moved by the words of the senator from Hawaii, not only his words, but the example that he has set to all Americans of heroism and sacrifice and service to his country, and a most valued member of the United States Senate, but more importantly, a genuine American hero. So I thank the senator from Hawaii for his continued service and his continued inspiration to all Americans, especially those who are serving in the military today.
My friend yield for a brief statement.
I'd be glad to
The
yield.
Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I, like my friend from Arizona, compliment my friend from Hawaii, but I think it speaks volumes to hear Senator John McCain talk about a hero. It's a hero talking about a hero. And far too rarely do we recognize these people that we have the opportunity to serve with here in the United States Senate. When I came here with Senator McCain, we came at the same time, we had a lot of people who were war veterans. It's not the case anymore. But I so appreciate John McCain, a certified, unqualified with statements, standing and talking about talking about Dan Inouye being a hero. I mean, this says, I repeat, volumes coming from someone that is a hero himself. So I have such admiration for both of these men. And for someone who's never served in the military, to have the pleasure of being able to serve and work together with these two men will be something that I will remember the rest of my life.
Mr. President.
Senator from Arizona.
I'm deeply touched by the kind and undeserved words of my old friend of many, many years, distinguished Majority Leader. We've had our spirited combat and our agreements and commitment, but we share a commitment, the two of us, for the betterment of this nation. And I'd also remind my friend from Nevada what he already knows, but I'd remind him it doesn't take a great deal of talent to get shot down. I was able to intercept a surface-to-air missile with my own airplane, which will not go down in the Aviation Hall of Fame, not to mention the several aircraft that I destroyed at taxpayers' expense in previous times. So I thank my dear friend from Nevada as well for his kind words. I'd like to speak to...
Mr. President, I appreciate the humility of my friend, and I've heard him say words to this effect before. And that's, fact is, that what he did after the plane went down is what we all will remember. As long as our country is the country that it is, we will always remember what happened after that plane went down, what John McCain did, setting an example for the world, and certainly his country.
Senator from Arizona.
Thank you. Mr. President, I asked to speak in morning business.
Senator is recognized.
I rise to speak about Russia and to review, particularly in light of the recent election in Russia and the relationship that we have, and review the state of what this administration has trumpeted as a so-called reset of U.S.-Russia relations, especially in light of the flawed Duma election that just occurred this weekend, and in light of my strong belief that the growing demand for dignity and uncorrupt governance that has defined the Arab world this year may impact Russia as well. Now, let me once again make clear that I am not opposed to U.S. engagement with Russia. I am not opposed to working consistently in good faith with Russia to find more ways to improve our relationship. To the contrary, we must continue to actively seek ways to cooperate with Russia in mutually beneficial ways. It is in our national interest to do so. And whatever can be said about the administration's policy toward Russia, no one can accuse them of a lack of sincerity and diligence in trying to increase cooperation with Russia. I would simply ask, what has been accomplished? What has been the result of the administration's good faith desire for a so-called reset of relations with Russia? The answer, I'm afraid, is precious little. Yes, there have been some areas of progress, but even those minor steps may now be getting rolled back. There's been a lot of news recently pertaining to our relationship with Russia and Russia's future development, which my colleagues may have missed. And it's very important to spend some time today and review these new developments. Let's start with the issue of missile defense. My colleagues will remember the debate we had here last year over the ratification of the New START Treaty. In that debate, we spent a lot of time discussing the Russian threat to withdraw from the treaty if the United States took any further steps to build up its missile defense capabilities. Specifically, the Russian government stated that the New START Treaty, quote, may be effective and viable only in conditions where there is no qualitative or quantitative buildup in the missile defense system capabilities of the United States of America. Now, the Russian government stated that in the ratification of the treaty. They went on to say that if those conditions were not met, Russia would exercise its right to withdraw from the treaty. Many of us felt strongly at the time and feel strongly now that it was a mistake to ratify a treaty on which the two signatories had two completely antithetical positions about the implications of that treaty, particularly as it pertains to one of our most vital national security programs, our national defenses, our missile defenses. Some of us thought and argued at the time that the United States should not voluntarily sign up to a treaty that would likely be used by the Russian government as a source of political pressure and blackmail to get us to make concessions on our missile defenses. Well, here we are, 1 year later, and let's review some of what the Russian government has been saying and doing in this regard. This is on November 23rd, we read an article from Bloomberg entitled, quote, Russia prepares to destroy U.S. shield. That is what it said, and I quote, Russian President Dmitry Medvedev ordered the military to prepare the capability to destroy the command structure of the planned U.S. missile defense system in Europe. Russia may also station strike missiles on its southern and western flanks, including Iskander rockets in the Kaliningrad enclave between Poland and Lithuania, both members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and the European Union. Medvedev said on state television today, quote, I have ordered the armed forces to develop measures to ensure, if necessary, that we can destroy the command and control systems of the U.S. shield, Medvedev said. Quote, these measures are appropriate, effective, and low cost. On the same day, we read the following in an article in the New York Times entitled, Russia Elevates Warning About U.S. Missile Defense Plan in Europe. And I go quote from the article. Russia will deploy its own missiles and could withdraw from the New START nuclear arms reduction treaty if the United States moves forward with its plans for a missile defense system in Europe. President Dmitry A. Medvedev warned on Wednesday. I have set the task to the armed forces to develop measures for disabling missile defense data and control systems, Mr. Medvedev said. But it was Mr. Medvedev's comments about the New START treaty put into effect this year that suggested a darkening tone in what has been a steady drumbeat of warnings out of Moscow in recent days over the plans for a missile defense system based in Europe. Quote, in the case of unfavorable development of the situation, Russia reserves the right to discontinue further steps in the field of disarmament and arms control, Mr. Medvedev said in a televised address from his residence just outside Moscow. Quote, given the intrinsic link between the strategic offensive and defensive arms conditions for our withdrawal from the New START treaty could also arise, he said. If all of this were not troubling enough, we then read on November 28 an article from a Russian state news agency entitled, quote, Russia's NATO envoy to visit China, Iran over missile defense. Here's what was reported. Russian envoy to NATO, Dmitry Rogozin, will visit China and Iran in mid-January to discuss a U.S.-backed global missile defense network. Quote, we are planning to visit both Beijing and Tehran soon under the Russian president's directive to discuss the planned deployment of a global missile defense network, Rogozin said during a roundtable meeting at the lower house of the Russian parliament. On November 28, the Russian government went even further, not just using the New START treaty to try to blackmail us into weakening our missile defenses, but threatening to cut off NATO supply routes into Afghanistan as well, which was another area of limited progress that the administration hailed as part of its so-called reset policy. This is how the Wall Street Journal described it last Monday in an article entitled, Russia Considers Blocking NATO Supply Routes. Russia said it may not let NATO use its territory to supply troops in Afghanistan if the alliance doesn't seriously consider its objections to a U.S.-led missile shield for Europe, Russia's ambassador to NATO said Monday. If NATO doesn't give a serious response, quote, we have to address matters in relations to other areas. Russian news services reported Dmitry Rogozin, ambassador to NATO, as saying. He added that Russia's cooperation on Afghanistan may be an area for review, the news services reported. So let me summarize. After being assured that the New START treaty would contribute to the improvement of U.S.-Russia relations and that the Russian government would not use the treaty against us as blackmail, we are now in a situation where the President of Russia is threatening to deploy ballistic missiles to destroy U.S. missile defense systems in Europe, where he is openly threatening to withdraw his government from the New START treaty if the United States does not make unacceptable concessions on its missile defense programs, and where the Russian ambassador to NATO is threatening to cut off NATO's supply routes to Afghanistan and planning to visit China and Iran with the purpose of deepening Russia's cooperation with those governments against U.S. missile defenses. I think it's safe to say that the effect to date of the New START treaty on the U.S.-Russia relationship is rather less positive than originally advertised. The problems in our relationship with Russia go well beyond missile defense, as important as that is. In recent months, as the Assad regime in Syria has slaughtered roughly 4,000 of its own citizens who are seeking a democratic future, what has been the Russian government's response? With the help of China, Russia has been absolutely shameless in blocking any serious action in the United Nations Security Council, including by vetoing a toothless Security Council resolution that would not have even imposed sanctions, but merely hinted at the possibility of sanctions. At the same time, while the Assad regime's bloody rampage has continued against the Syrian people, the Russian government has continued to serve as its primary supplier of weaponry. In fact, just last week, in a story entitled "Russia Delivers Missiles to Syria," AFP reported that despite the brutal violence of the Assad regime and over Israel's strenuous objections, Russia delivered 72 supersonic cruise missiles to the Syrian government, worth at least $300 million. Then there's Russia's continued interference in the sovereign territory and internal affairs of the Republic of Georgia, a country that the Russian military invaded in 2008 and continues to occupy to this day. 2 weeks ago, there was a presidential election in the breakaway state of South Ossetia, which is part of Georgia's sovereign territory. But when Moscow's preferred candidate was overwhelmingly defeated in those elections, the Supreme Court of this Russian proxy state declared the results illegal and nullified the vote. Russian parliamentarians applauded. Finally, there's the unfortunate issue of Russia's continued backsliding on human rights and democracy. A few months ago, President Medvedev announced, as we all know, that he would step aside in Russia's election next year so that Vladimir Putin could once again run for the Russian presidency. Some see this as a sign that Putin will come back. I object to that characterization because I don't believe Putin ever left. He's been running things in Russia with no less informal power than he had as president. Not surprisingly, over the past 3 years, the state of human rights and freedom in that country has gotten no better. In fact, things have gotten worse. Perhaps the clearest evidence of this fact is the tragic and heartbreaking case of Sergei Magnitsky, a Russian tax attorney working for an international company, Hermitage Capital, that had invested in Russia. Magnitsky did not spend his life as a human rights activist or an outspoken critic of the Russian government. He was an ordinary man, but he became an extraordinary champion of justice and the rule of law in a Russia where those principles have lost nearly all meaning. What Magnitsky uncovered was that a collection of Russian government officials and criminals associated with them colluded to defraud the Russian state of $230 million. The Russian government, in turn, blamed the crime on Hermitage Capital and threw Magnitsky in prison in 2008. Magnitsky was detained for 11 months without trial. Russian officials, especially from the Interior Ministry, pressured Magnitsky to deny what he had uncovered, to lie and recant. But he refused. He was sickened by what his government had done, and he refused to surrender. As a result, he was transferred to increasingly more severe and more horrific prison conditions. He was forced to eat unclean food and drink unclean water. He was denied basic medical care, even as his health continued to deteriorate. In fact, he was placed in even worse conditions until on November 16, 2009, having served 358 days in prison, Sergei Magnitsky died. He was 37 years old. The Magnitsky case shined a light on the tragic realities of human rights abuses in Russia today. And the overwhelming cruelty and injustice that Magnitsky endured has made it impossible for the government and the people of Russia to ignore. Even the Public Oversight Commission of the City of Moscow for the Control of the Observance of Human Rights in Places of Forced Detention, a Russian organization empowered by Russian law to independently monitor the country's prison conditions, concluded the following in a report this year, and I quote, A man who is kept in custody and is being detained is not capable of using all the necessary means to protect either his life or his health. This is a responsibility of a state which holds him captive. Therefore, the case of Sergei Magnitsky can be described as a breach of the right to life. The members of the Civic Supervisory Commission have reached the conclusion that Magnitsky had been experiencing both psychological and physical pressure in custody, and the conditions in some of the wards can be justifiably called torturous. The people responsible for this must be punished. The case of Sergei Magnitsky is but an extreme example of a problem that is all too common in Russia today. The flagrant violations of human rights and the rule of law committed by the Russian government and its allies outside of government. We see the problem in the show trial of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, which I would remind my colleagues was unfolding at the exact same time that this body was debating the ratification of the New START treaty last December. After the Russian government stole Khodorkovsky's oil company, it then turned around and charged him for the crime. Even more absurdly, as he was nearing the end of his 8-year prison sentence, the Russian state then charged him again for virtually the same crime. Before the judge had even handed down his verdict, Prime Minister Putin said Khodorkovsky, quote, should sit in jail, unquote. And lo and behold, that is exactly what the judge ultimately ruled, sentencing Khodorkovsky to 5 additional years in prison on top of the 8 years he had already served. Earlier this year, not surprisingly, Khodorkovsky lost his appeal of this ruling. In a report released this year, Freedom House concluded that the cases of Magnitsky and Khodorkovsky, quote, put an international spotlight on the Russian state's contempt for the rule of law. By silencing influential and accomplished figures such as Khodorkovsky and Magnitsky, the Russian authorities have made it abundantly clear that anyone in Russia can be silenced. The violations of human rights in Russia also extend to the deep and worsening problem of corruption, which perhaps as much as any other issue mobilizes the frustration and anger of the Russian public. In its annual index of perceptions of corruption, the independent organization Transparency International ranked Russia 154th out of 178 countries. This means that Russia is perceived as more corrupt than Pakistan, Yemen, and Zimbabwe. The World Bank considers 122 countries to be better places to do business than Russia. I would point out that one of those countries is the Republic of Georgia, which is ranked 12th by the World Bank. When we consider the pattern of corruption and abuse that the Russian government has perpetrated over many years, it's not surprising to see the outpouring of anger and dissatisfaction that Russian voters expressed in this weekend's parliamentary elections. Unfortunately, the conduct of that election, and especially its aftermath, has only validated the growing frustration that Russians feel for their rulers. Before the ballots were even cast, a respected Russian election monitoring organization called Golos was subjected to intimidation, harassment, political pressure, and fines. The subsequent election has been criticized by impartial international observers, including the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which documented in its preliminary assessment numerous irregularities and other efforts by the government to sway a vote in its favor. Incidents of ballot stuffing have been documented. For example, in Chechnya, it was reported that 99% of the population participated in the election and 99.5% of them voted for Putin's party. That seems a little suspicious, especially considering that the Putin government has waged years of bloody warfare in Chechnya. Despite the fact that the recent Duma election fell short of international standards and violated Russia's law, substantially fewer Russian voters chose to cast their vote for Putin's party, including in its stronghold and home base of St. Petersburg. This frustration has subsequently poured into the streets, where Russian citizens have peacefully sought to demonstrate against the recent election fraud. The Russian government has responded in turn by arresting hundreds of opposition leaders, democracy and human rights activists, journalists, and other members of civil society, including Boris Nemtsov, Alexei Navalny, and Ilya Yashin. These men and women are exercising universal human rights and fundamental freedoms which should not be a crime in any country. I call on the government of Russia to release every Russian citizen that is unjustly detained for political purposes and to clarify the whereabouts and conditions of these individuals. I ask unanimous consent for 4 additional minutes.
Without objection, the senator is recognized for 4 additional minutes.
Mr. President, throughout this year, I have said that the demand for dignity and justice and democracy that is shaking the Arab world to its foundations will not be confined to that one region alone. It will spread. It will inspire others. It will demonstrate to others that the frustrations and indignities and lack of hope that they may feel today need not be the realities that they endure tomorrow. They can change those realities. They can change their destiny. They can change their countries. And it appears that message may be resonating with the people in Russia. We should hope that it does resonate, and resonate in a peaceful manner, because we agree with a growing number of Russians who clearly believe that they deserve better. They deserve a government that respects and responds to their aspirations for a better life. And they deserve the power to freely elect their own leaders. The political development of Russia is more than an issue of moral principle for the United States. It is closely tied to our national interests. We have seen in the past that when autocratic governments feel they are losing legitimacy among their people at home, they try to demonize others, both in their country and beyond it, and redirect their public's anger against imaginary enemies. We have seen how the Putin government has done this in the past. We have seen its attempts to paint the United States and our NATO and other allies as enemies of Russia and to lash out against us in the hope of mobilizing public support at home. This is why the growing pattern of confrontation from the Russian government that we have seen in recent months over missile defense and resupply efforts into Afghanistan and other issues that should be so concerning to us, and why we must understand that the actions of the Russian government cannot be separated from its character. In fact, as Russia's government grows less tolerant of its own people's rights at home, we should not be surprised if it treats us the same way. As I have said before, I believe we need greater realism about Russia, but that is not the same as pessimism or cynicism or demonization. I am ultimately an optimist, and I often find sources for hope in the most hopeless of places. 1 year ago, after languishing in prison for 7 years and facing the near certainty that of enduring many more, Mikhail Khodorkovsky spoke before his sentencing about the hopes of the Russian people as they watched his trial. They are watching, he said, with the hope that Russia will, after all, become a country of freedom and of the law, where supporting opposition parties will cease being a cause for reprisals, where the special services will protect the people and the law and not the bureaucracy from the people and the law, where human rights will no longer depend on the mood of the czar, good or evil, where, on the contrary, the power will truly be independent on the citizens and the court, only on law and God. For me, as for anybody, it's hard to live in jail, and I do not want to die there. But if I have to, I will not hesitate. The things I believe in are worth dying for. That there are still men and women of such spirit in Russia is cause for hope. And eventually, maybe not this year or next year or the year after that, but eventually the Russian people will have a government that is worthy of their aspirations For equal justice can be delayed and human dignity can be denied, but not forever. I yield the floor, and I thank my colleagues.
Senator from Hawaii.
President, I wish to thank my most distinguished friend from Arizona for his generous, warm, and friendly remarks. They mean a lot to me, and I'll never forget them. Thank you very much.
Well done. Well done.
The demonstration.
Mr. President.
Senator from Vermont's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I wanted to say a few words about an issue of enormous importance to the people of the state of Vermont and people all over this country, and that is the issue of making sure that in America this winter nobody goes cold, that nobody freezes to death, that children do not become ill because the thermostats in their homes are turned down so low. And the issue that I am talking about is to ask for support for legislation that is being introduced by Senator Jack Reed of Rhode Island and Senator Olympia Snowe of Maine, which would level fund the LIHEAP program at $4.7 billion. And as most of my colleagues know, the LIHEAP program is the Low-Income Heating Energy Assistance Program. Here is the problem that we face, Mr. President. We are in the midst of a horrendous recession. Unemployment is sky high. In many cases, wages are in decline. Poverty is increasing. And at the same time, the price for home heating oil and propane gas is going up. According to the Energy Information Administration, average expenditures for households that heat with oil or propane are forecast to be higher than in any previous winter. And heating oil prices are currently averaging about $3.90 a gallon. So what people in the Northeast, people all over this country are looking at is the highest home heating oil prices that we have ever seen, coming in the midst of a terrible recession with unemployment high and wages in decline. In the state of Vermont, heating oil prices are already 34% higher than they were at the same time last year. They are currently $3.82 a gallon compared to $2.85 a gallon last year. And what is happening is that because of cuts, significant cuts in LIHEAP funding, the average LIHEAP benefit in Vermont is 45% less this year than it was last year. That is $474 per family as opposed to $866 last year. Mr. President, one of the things that has got to be understood about LIHEAP is that nearly 80% of funding from this program goes to our citizens who are elderly, families with preschool kids, and the disabled. So the people who benefit from this program are some of the most vulnerable people in our country. 80% of the funding, once again, goes to senior citizens, families with preschool children, young children, and people who are dealing with disabilities. Mr. President, it is not uncommon in the state of Vermont and in other states for the temperature to drop to 10 below zero, 20 below zero in the wintertime. And when people do not have enough funds to heat their homes or their apartments, serious problems arise. What I want to do, Mr. President, is just to take a moment to read you some comments that my office has received from Vermonters all over the state who are trying desperately to stay warm this winter. Josie Crosby, who is 81 years of age, who lives in Brattleboro, Vermont, this is what she said: "We will have money for one more tank. After that, I don't know." End of quote. That is a woman, 81 years of age, has money for one more tank of oil. After that, she's not sure how she stays warm in the winter. A 48-year-old Vermonter from Orleans County in the northern part of our state wrote, and I quote, "I was able to get 100 gallons of fuel last week, and for that I'm grateful. The struggle begins now on how to stretch that fuel as long as possible. I had to buy a portable electric heater to keep halfway warm while waiting for fuel assistance. I don't even want to know how high my electric bill will be. I am an honorably discharged disabled veteran and have limited funds. I have already slashed my food bill, so what goes next? My meds, my electric service, my home." And that is from a disabled vet in the northern part of the state of Vermont. A 59-year-old woman in central Vermont writes, and I quote, "I have been keeping my thermostat as low as I can almost tolerate. I bundle up in the house with several sweaters and even a coat and hat at times. When company arrives, I'm embarrassed at how ridiculous I probably appear. I am just barely squeaking through each month. I have made cuts everywhere possible, including food." End of quote. Wendy Raven from Whittingham, Vermont writes, she's 62 years of age, "I had to drag my bed out of my bedroom and put it in the living room, then close off the bedroom for the winter. I will have to eat even less than I do now in order to pay my fuel bills. I have done everything I can to button up the place, but now all I can do is pray I get through the winter without a bill so large it will again take me until next fall to pay it off." End of quote. Is that where we are in the United States of America, that we force people to live under those conditions? A 31-year-old woman from Bennington, Vermont writes, and I quote, "We are now trying to stay warm by scrapping up enough for a gallon or two of heating oil a week and keeping the thermostat down very low. I turn the furnace off during the day when my child is in school and turn it on an hour before she gets home so that the house gets warm. We are hoping to qualify for crisis fuel assistance, or we are in trouble, because there is nowhere to get the extra money needed to pay for the fuel, especially considering its continuously increasing cost. We have to choose what bills to pay each month and what ones not to pay in order to put food on the table." So, Mr. President, in this great nation, in the midst of a recession, in the midst of high unemployment, in the midst of growing poverty, we as a United States Senate must be very clear. Nobody in this country is going to go cold this winter. We are not going to pick up a paper in Maine or Rhode Island or Vermont or North Dakota and read that some senior citizen was found frozen to death. That is not what we are going to allow. And that is why Senator Jack Reed, Senator Olympia Snowe, and I, and many others, are working hard so that at the very, very least we can level fund LIHEAP so that nobody in our country goes cold this winter. And with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor and note